January 1969. 8 in the morning. Twickenham Film Studios. The Beatles, the biggest band on the planet, are freezing their asses off in a cavernous soundstage that feels more like a warehouse than a recording space. There's no heat. The vibe is already tense. And for some reason, Paul McCartney thought it would be brilliant to force everyone to show up at dawn to rehearse like they're some unknown garage band trying to make it big. Except they're not unknown. They're the Beatles. And they absolutely do not want to be here. The cameras are rolling. That's the other thing. This whole nightmare is being filmed for a documentary that's supposed to show the world how the Beatles create their magic. Instead, it's capturing something way more uncomfortable. Four men who've spent nearly a decade together, now barely able to look each other in the eye. John Lennon sitting there with Yoko Ono literally attached to his side, barely engaged with the music. George Harrison looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. Ringo just trying to keep the peace while playing drums. And Paul, desperately trying to hold this sinking ship together with sheer force of will. This was supposed to be the Get Back project. Paul's grand idea to save the band by stripping everything down and returning to their roots. Live performance, raw energy, just four guys playing rock and roll like the old days in Hamburg and the Cavern Club. But here's what Paul didn't account for. Nobody else wanted to go back. John had moved on, both musically and personally. George was tired of being treated like the kid brother whose songs didn't matter. And Ringo was just watching it all fall apart, powerless to stop it. The plan was ambitious, maybe too ambitious. Write brand new songs on the spot, rehearse them, then perform them live for a television special that would remind the world why the Beatles mattered. All of this while being filmed every single day. No privacy, no space to work through problems, just cameras capturing every argument, every awkward silence, every moment of tension that had been building for years. George Martin, their trusted producer, their fifth Beatle, wasn't even really involved this time. He showed up occasionally, but he could sense something was deeply wrong. The magic was gone. In his place was Glyn Johns, a talented engineer, but not the man who'd been there since the beginning. Not the one who understood how to navigate the egos and creative differences that were now threatening to tear everything apart. 10 days. That's all it took. 10 days of this freezing, miserable, camera-filled hell before one of them finally broke. And when that happened, it became clear that this album wasn't just unwanted. It might actually destroy them. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was still months away, involving a producer none of them asked for, orchestras nobody wanted, and a final product that would haunt Paul McCartney for over 3 decades. Let's rewind a bit. How did the world's biggest band end up in this disaster? It starts with Paul McCartney in late 1968, watching everything he helped build start to crumble. The White Album sessions had been brutal. Ringo quit temporarily. George was getting increasingly frustrated. John was consumed by his relationship with Yoko and his heroin use. The center wasn't holding. Paul saw this happening and panicked. His solution? Go back to basics. Forget the studio experimentation. Forget the orchestra arrangements and the tape loops and all the psychedelic production tricks that had defined their recent work. Just get back to being a band. Play live. Connect with audiences again. Remind themselves why they started making music in the first place. On paper, it made sense. In reality, it was the worst possible idea at the worst possible time. The problem was simple. Paul was the only one who wanted this. John Lennon had zero interest in touring again or playing the hits for screaming fans who couldn't even hear the music. He'd moved beyond that. His head was in avant-garde art, in political activism, in building a life with Yoko that existed outside the Beatles' bubble. The idea of going back felt like regression, not evolution. And Yoko's constant presence during sessions? That was John's way of showing everyone that his priorities had shifted. The band was no longer his whole world. George Harrison was dealing with his own frustration. He'd grown into an incredible songwriter. He had Something and Here Comes the Sun and While My Guitar Gently Weeps in his catalog. But during Beatles sessions, he was still treated like the junior member. Paul would tell him how to play guitar. John would dismiss his songs. He was tired of fighting for scraps when he knew he had something valuable to contribute. The Get Back sessions were just more of the same, except now it was being filmed. Ringo, as always, was caught in the middle. He loved these guys. He didn't want to see the band end, but he also couldn't fix what was broken. All he could do was show up, play his parts, and hope that somehow they'd find their way back to each other. Spoiler alert, they wouldn't. Then there was the structure of this whole project. Paul wanted to write songs on the spot, in front of cameras, then perform them live within weeks. That's insane pressure for any artist, let alone four artists who were barely communicating. The Beatles had always worked best when they had time and space to experiment, to try things and fail privately, to build songs slowly. This format eliminated all of that. Everything was exposed, every bad idea, every argument, every moment of creative drought was being captured on film for posterity. And the venue choice? Twickenham Film Studios at 8 in the morning? The Beatles were night owls. They'd spent years recording at Abbey Road late into the evening, fueled by tea and creativity and the freedom that came with darkness. Morning sessions in a cold, impersonal film studio felt like punishment. It felt like work. And the Beatles had never treated their music like work before. That was part of what made them special. But now, under Paul's plan, it was all business. Clock in, create, clock out. The joy was gone. What they were about to create reflected that emptiness perfectly. January 10th, 1969. Day 10 of rehearsals. The cameras are rolling as usual, capturing another tense morning at Twickenham. Paul and George are working through a song, but it's not really collaboration. It's Paul telling George what to play, how to play it, basically directing him like he's a session musician instead of a founding member of the band. George is trying to stay calm, but you can see it in his face. He's done. The argument that morning wasn't even about anything specific. It was about everything. Years of Paul's controlling nature, years of having his songs pushed aside, years of being the quiet one, the one who didn't get the same respect as John and Paul. George had been writing incredible music. While My Guitar Gently Weeps had proven he belonged in the same conversation as the Lennon-McCartney partnership. But here, in this freezing studio, he was still being treated like a sideman. John didn't help. He sat there, mostly checked out, offering the occasional sarcastic comment that made everything worse. When George tried to assert himself, John dismissed it. There's footage of John saying they're lazy, that they've been playing for 20 years and maybe they've just run out of steam. Imagine hearing that from your bandmate, your friend, someone you've been through everything with. It's not just criticism, it's surrender. It's John basically admitting he doesn't care anymore. George stood up, he said he was leaving the band. And then he walked out. Just like that. The greatest band in the world down to 3 members, with cameras capturing every second of the collapse. Paul tried to play it off, suggesting they could just get Eric Clapton to replace him, but you could tell he was shaken. Ringo looked devastated. Even John seemed surprised, though he tried to hide it. For days there was chaos. Would George come back? Could the band continue without him? They tried jamming as a 3-piece, but it felt hollow. The Beatles without George Harrison wasn't the Beatles. It was just 3 guys playing music, waiting for the inevitable end. Phone calls were made, meetings were held. George had conditions if he was going to return. No more filming at Twickenham. Move the session somewhere more comfortable. And most importantly, respect. He wanted his songs taken seriously. He wanted input on arrangements without being talked over. They agreed. The sessions would move to Apple Studios in the basement of their Savile Row office building. Smaller space, more intimate, hopefully less miserable. George returned on January 22nd, but the damage was done. Everyone knew this was temporary. They were going through the motions now, trying to salvage something from this disaster. The question wasn't if the Beatles would break up anymore. It was when. But here's where it gets even more ridiculous. They moved to Apple Studios expecting a state-of-the-art recording environment. After all, they'd hired Magic Alex, this supposed electronics genius, to build them a custom 72-track recording studio. 72 tracks. That would have been revolutionary. Except Magic Alex was a fraud. The studio he built was completely unusable. Nothing worked. The equipment was junk. They had to borrow gear from Abbey Road just to record anything. The Beatles had spent something like $72,000 on this fake studio, and now they were stuck trying to make an album in a basement with borrowed equipment and broken relationships. The only bright spot? Billy Preston. They brought in Billy, a talented keyboard player they'd known since the Hamburg days, and suddenly the vibe improved. Having an outsider in the room forced everyone to behave. They couldn't fight as openly with a guest present. Billy's playing added something fresh to the music. For a brief moment, it felt like maybe this project could work, but that moment wouldn't last long. Nothing good ever did during these sessions. Let's talk about Magic Alex for a second, because this whole situation is almost too absurd to believe. Yanni Alexis Mardas, known as Magic Alex, was a Greek electronics engineer who somehow convinced the Beatles, particularly John Lennon, that he was a technical genius who could revolutionize recording technology. He promised them impossible things. A studio with 72 tracks when most studios had 8 or 16, sonic force fields, wallpaper that could act as speakers. All of it was nonsense, but John believed him. The Beatles gave him $72,000 and carte blanche to build their dream studio in the basement of 3 Savile Row, the Apple Corps headquarters. This was going to be their creative sanctuary, a place where they could work without dealing with EMI, or George Martin's schedules, or anyone else's limitations. Complete artistic freedom in a technological wonderland. Except when they actually showed up to use the studio in January 1969, they discovered it was completely fake. Nothing worked. The mixing console looked impressive, but didn't actually function. The equipment was basically stage props. George Martin was horrified when he saw it. He knew immediately that nothing professional could be recorded there. They had to scramble, bringing in proper equipment from Abbey Road, setting up a functional recording environment while pretending that Magic Alex's disaster didn't exist. It was embarrassing. Here's the biggest band in the world with unlimited resources, and they'd been scammed by a con artist with a charming accent and big promises. John eventually realized he'd been fooled, but by then the damage was done. The studio situation was just another symbol of how chaotic and mismanaged everything had become. But they pushed forward anyway. The basement at Apple became their workspace. It was cramped and improvised, but at least they weren't at Twickenham anymore. And then Billy Preston showed up, and suddenly there was a reason to be professional again. Billy brought energy. His keyboard playing on Get Back and Don't Let Me Down elevated those songs. His presence created a buffer between the feuding Beatles. They couldn't have screaming matches with Billy sitting right there. They had to pretend everything was fine, which ironically made things slightly more functional. The sessions from January 22 to January 31st produced some genuinely good music despite everything. Get Back was raw and energetic. Don't Let Me Down was emotionally powerful. Let It Be was beautiful, even in its unfinished state. George's I Me Mine showed what he was capable of when given space. They were creating, but they weren't enjoying it. Every song felt like pulling teeth. Every decision was a negotiation. Every moment was exhausting. And then came January 30th, 1969. The rooftop concert, Paul's grand finale to the Get Back project. They'd set up on the roof of Apple Studios and play live, just like he'd wanted from the beginning. The police showed up. Crowds gathered on the street below. For 42 minutes, the Beatles played together in public for what would be the last time ever. Get Back, Don't Let Me Down, I've Got a Feeling. The cold wind whipping around them, Ringo in a red raincoat, John in Yoko's fur coat. It was chaotic and imperfect, and strangely beautiful. When the police finally made them stop, John said into the microphone, "I'd like to say thank you on behalf of the group and ourselves, and I hope we passed the audition." Classic Lennon sarcasm, classic Beatles humor. For a moment, it felt like maybe they could end this project on a high note. The rooftop concert would be the climax of the documentary. The music would be compiled into an album, and everyone could move forward. Except that's not what happened. What happened next was so much worse than anyone could have imagined. The album that was supposed to bring them back together was about to spend over a year in limbo, unwanted and unfinished, while the Beatles tried desperately to forget it existed. The sessions ended January 31st, 1969. The tapes were handed over to Glyn Johns, the engineer who'd been documenting everything. His job was simple in theory. Take all this footage and all these recordings and create an album. Make it sound good. Make it feel cohesive. Make it live up to the Beatles' standard. But simple in theory became impossible in practice, because nobody in the band could agree on anything anymore. And more importantly, nobody really wanted to deal with it. Glyn Johns put together his first mix in May 1969. He called it Get Back. The concept was to keep everything raw and live-sounding, true to Paul's original vision. Minimal overdubs, the mistakes left in, studio chatter between songs. The whole thing was supposed to feel like you were there in the room with them. He sent it to the band for approval. They rejected it. Too rough, too unpolished. It didn't sound like a Beatles album. It sounded like a demo tape. So Glyn tried again. January 1970, he created another version. Different song order, some different mixes, cleaner in places. He thought maybe this would be the one they'd accept. He was wrong. The Beatles rejected it again. At this point, John Lennon was openly saying he couldn't face looking at the material. The sessions had been so miserable, so exhausting, that the thought of releasing that music as an album felt like admitting defeat, like telling the world that the magic was gone, and all that remained was four guys who couldn't stand being in a room together. Here's the crazy part. Instead of releasing the Get Back album, they just shelved it. Completely. They went back into Abbey Road Studios in the summer of 1969 and recorded an entirely different album, Abbey Road. They worked with George Martin again. They made something beautiful and cohesive and artistically ambitious. Come Together. Something. Here Comes the Sun. The Side 2 medley. It was everything Get Back wasn't. It was proof they could still create magic when they wanted to. And they released Abbey Road in September 1969, pretending the whole Get Back disaster never happened. But the tapes still existed. Hours and hours of footage, music that had been recorded, a documentary that had been filmed. Apple Corps had spent a fortune on this project. Michael Lindsay Hogg, the director, was sitting on all this material with no idea what to do with it. The Beatles had essentially abandoned it. They'd moved on. Abbey Road was their farewell, the album they actually wanted to release. Get Back was the embarrassing failed experiment they hoped everyone would forget about. Except you can't just forget about Beatles recordings. The pressure to release something was building. Apple Corps needed product. The documentary needed to come out. And the band, despite everything, was still contractually obligated to EMI. They needed to deliver albums. But nobody wanted to be the one to wade back into those tapes. Nobody wanted to relive those sessions. George Martin certainly didn't want to touch it. He'd barely been involved in the first place, and what he'd heard sounded like a mess. Throughout 1969 and into early 1970, the Get Back tapes just sat there, unreleased, unfinished, a monument to everything that had gone wrong. John was focused on his solo work and his peace activism with Yoko. Paul was dealing with personal depression and starting to accept that the Beatles were over. George was finally getting the recognition he deserved as a songwriter. Ringo was just trying to maintain friendships with everyone while the business side of the band became increasingly toxic. Then Alan Klein entered the picture. Klein was a ruthless American businessman who'd been brought in to manage Apple Corps and sort out the Beatles' financial chaos. 3 of the Beatles, John, George, and Ringo, trusted him. Paul absolutely did not. This division would become crucial because Klein had ideas about those abandoned Get Back tapes, and the person he wanted to bring in to fix them would become one of the most controversial decisions in Beatles history. March 1970. The Beatles are essentially broken up, even though it hasn't been officially announced yet. Paul is recording his first solo album. John is in Denmark with Yoko. George is working on his own material, and those Get Back tapes are still sitting there, unfinished and unwanted. That's when Alan Klein makes a decision that will haunt Beatles history forever. He brings in Phil Spector to produce the album. Phil Spector was famous for his wall of sound production technique. Massive orchestrations, layers and layers of instruments, dense dramatic arrangements that filled every possible sonic space. His work with the Ronettes and the Righteous Brothers had been groundbreaking. But his style was the complete opposite of what the Get Back project was supposed to be. This was supposed to be raw, stripped down. Just 4 guys playing live. Instead, Klein hired the one producer who would inevitably add strings and choirs and orchestras to everything. John Lennon defended the choice by saying the original tapes were the shittiest load of badly recorded material I've ever heard. That's a direct quote. John, who'd been there for those sessions, thought the recordings were beyond saving without serious intervention. George and Ringo agreed. They wanted someone to make the album listenable, to turn this disaster into something they could release without embarrassment. Paul wasn't consulted. He was in Scotland, dealing with his own issues, and the other 3 Beatles made the decision without him. Spector went to work in March and April 1970. He listened to the tapes and apparently agreed with John. The recordings were rough. The performances were uneven. The whole thing lacked polish. So he did what Phil Spector always did. He went big. He booked massive orchestral sessions. He brought in 50-piece string sections. He added 14-person choirs. He took these intimate, flawed recordings and buried them under layers of production. The most controversial moment came on April 1, 1970. Spector booked Abbey Road Studio 1, the big orchestral room, and recorded an elaborate string and choir arrangement for The Long and Winding Road. Paul's ballad, which had been recorded as a simple piano-driven song, was now drowning in violins and cellos and harp and orchestral drums. It was everything Paul McCartney hated about overproduction. It was the antithesis of the Get Back concept, and it was being done without his knowledge or permission. Legend has it that during the session, Spector had a bit of a meltdown. He was temperamental under the best circumstances, and apparently things weren't going exactly how he wanted. Ringo, who was present for the session, had to calm him down and keep things moving. It's a bizarre image. Ringo Starr, the peacekeeper, managing Phil Spector's ego, while Spector dramatically reimagines Beatles songs without half the band being aware it's even happening. George Martin, the Beatles' actual producer, the man who'd been with them from the beginning, was completely shut out of this process. He heard what Spector was doing and was disgusted. Later, he'd say that the production credit should read, "Produced by George Martin, overproduced by Phil Spector." That's how strongly he felt about it. This wasn't fixing the album. This was changing it into something it was never meant to be. But Klein and Spector didn't care. They had the backing of 3 Beatles. That was enough. The 4th Beatle, the one who'd actually conceived this whole project, was about to hear the final product and lose his mind. Paul McCartney received an acetate copy of the album in mid-April 1970. He put it on his turntable expecting to hear the raw, live Get Back album he'd envisioned. Instead, he heard Phil Spector's wall of sound crushing his songs under orchestral arrangements he never approved. The Long and Winding Road, his deeply personal ballad, now featured strings he'd never asked for, female choir vocals he didn't want, and production choices that completely changed the song's emotional tone. He was furious, absolutely livid. This wasn't a collaboration. This was a hostile takeover of his music. Spector had taken Paul's composition and turned it into something unrecognizable. The simplicity was gone. The intimacy was destroyed. In its place was this overblown, melodramatic arrangement that felt like it belonged in a movie soundtrack, not on a Beatles album. And the worst part? It had all happened without anyone asking his opinion. April 14, 1970, Paul wrote an angry letter to Alan Klein. The letter was direct and cutting. He demanded that the orchestration and choir on The Long and Winding Road be reduced. He wanted the harp removed. He wanted the production stripped back to something closer to the original recording. And then he added a line that dripped with barely controlled rage. "Don't ever do it again." It wasn't a request, it was a warning. This was his music, his band, and he was being completely ignored. Klein received the letter. He did absolutely nothing. The album was already being pressed. The release date was set for May 8, 1970. Changing anything now would cost money and delay the release, and Klein was not interested in either of those things. Paul's objections were noted and then completely disregarded. The album would come out exactly as Spector had produced it. Paul's wishes, his artistic vision, his role as the person who'd actually started this whole project, none of it mattered. George Martin was equally disgusted. He'd been the Beatles' producer for nearly a decade. He'd helped shape their sound from the beginning. He'd been patient with their experiments, supportive of their growth, protective of their legacy. And now this album was going out into the world with production that he considered tasteless and excessive. His famous comment about the production credit wasn't just a joke. It was a genuine expression of disappointment at what had been done to the band's music in their final moment. The timing of the release made everything worse. Paul had announced he was leaving the Beatles on April 10, 1970, just days before he received the acetate. His solo album, McCartney, came out on April 17th. The band was officially over. And now, on May 8th, the world was going to hear this album that nobody wanted to make, produced by someone half the band never wanted involved, as the final official Beatles release. It was a depressing, anticlimactic end to the greatest band in history. The album's packaging reflected the sadness of it all. The cover showed 4 separate photos of the Beatles, not together, but isolated. John looking distant, Paul looking uncomfortable, George looking serious, Ringo looking resigned. Inside, there were images from the film sessions, reminders of how miserable everyone had been. The title had been changed from Get Back to Let It Be, which somehow felt even more final. Let it be. Accept what's happened. move on. It was practically a funeral. Critics noticed immediately that something was wrong. Reviews talked about how the album felt like a cardboard tombstone, a sad and tatty end to the Beatles' catalog. Even fans who loved the band could sense that this wasn't a proper conclusion. It felt compromised and incomplete. The magic that had defined Beatles albums for years was absent, replaced by tension and exhaustion. Paul's fury wasn't just about the orchestration. It was about watching his attempt to save the band become the final proof that the band couldn't be saved. Let It Be came out on May 8, 1970, and the response was complicated. Commercially, it was successful because it was the Beatles. The album hit #1 in multiple countries. Singles like Let It Be and Get Back were massive hits. But everyone knew this wasn't really a triumph. This was the sound of a band collapsing, packaged and sold to the public. The documentary came out soon after, and it was even more uncomfortable to watch. All that tension, all those arguments, all captured on film for everyone to see. John Lennon and George Harrison defended Phil Spector's work. John insisted that Spector had saved the album from being unlistenable. George appreciated how Spector had added drama and production value to songs that felt unfinished. They genuinely believed Spector had done them a favor, but Paul never changed his mind. He heard Spector's production as a betrayal, an artistic violation that represented everything wrong with how the band had ended. The orchestration on The Long and Winding Road particularly haunted him. For years, Paul tried to do something about it. He couldn't legally change the album. The masters were owned by EMI and Apple Corps. Klein had approved the Spector production. 3 Beatles had signed off on it. Paul was outvoted, but he never let it go. In interviews, he'd talk about how much he hated what Spector had done. He'd play the original version of The Long and Winding Road in concert, making sure audiences knew that's how the song was supposed to sound. Simple piano, simple melody, no strings drowning everything out. The acetate copy that Paul received in 1970 became a kind of artifact. Spector had written Paul a long letter trying to justify the production choices, explaining his vision for each song. Paul kept it, along with his angry letter to Alan Klein. These documents were proof that he'd objected, that he'd tried to stop this from happening. They didn't change anything at the time, but they mattered to him. They represented his attempt to maintain artistic control over his own music. George Martin remained disappointed by the album for the rest of his life. He'd watched the band he'd helped create from the beginning tear itself apart, and then their final album had been produced by someone else using techniques Martin considered excessive. His comment about being overproduced by Phil Spector wasn't bitter. It was sad. It was a statement of fact. The album that should have been a return to basics had become the opposite, and Martin knew it wasn't what any of them had really wanted. Then came 2003. More than 3 decades after Let It Be was released, Paul finally got the chance to fix it. Technology had advanced, legal situations had changed, and Paul worked with engineers to create Let It Be Naked. They went back to the original tapes from 1969. They stripped away all of Spector's orchestration. No strings on The Long and Winding Road. No wall of sound production techniques. No studio chatter between songs. Just the raw performances from the Get Back sessions, cleaned up and properly mixed. The difference was dramatic. The Long and Winding Road finally sounded how Paul had imagined it. Intimate, emotional. His piano and voice at the center, not buried under strings. The whole album felt lighter, more honest. It was what the Get Back project should have been in 1970. Even Ringo admitted that Paul had been right. The stripped-down version sounded great. Spector's production, while technically impressive, had obscured the actual music. But here's the thing. Let It Be. Naked couldn't erase what happened. The original Let It Be album still existed. It was still the official final Beatles release. The documentary still showed four men who didn't want to be there. The history couldn't be rewritten. Paul got his artistic redemption in 2003, but it was 33 years too late to change the fact that the album nobody wanted to make had become exactly what they'd feared: a messy, compromised ending to the greatest story in rock and roll. The Get Back project started as Paul's desperate attempt to save the Beatles by returning to their roots. It ended as proof that you can't force magic when everyone's ready to move on. The album sat unwanted for over a year. It was produced by the wrong person. It was released after the band had broken up. And it haunted Paul McCartney for decades until he could finally present it the way he'd always intended. That's the real story of Let It Be. Not just an album, but a 33-year battle over how the Beatles' ending should sound. Paul eventually won that battle, but by then, everyone knew the damage had already been done.